Dragon's Dogma 2 has seen its fair share of tweaks and improvements since launch, but none so drastic as the one afforded by PlayStation 5 Pro. On the one hand, it utilizes PS5 Pro's PSSR upscaling to generate a cleaner, crisper picture, while on the other, there's a major performance boost over the base PS5. The bottom line is, for those chasing a locked 60 frames per second experience, PS5 Pro now offers a way to do so. Except there's a few caveats, a few quid pro quos to go with this. Sadly, and as with several other PS5 Pro patched games we've seen early on, Dragon's Dogma 2's use of PSSR has a few side effects. To be blunt, image quality suffers from extra breakup on fine elements, while the game's ray-traced global illumination also suffers from extra flickering and noise. So then, between all three graphics modes offered on PS5 Pro, which one ultimately gets us to the 60 FPS target? And which one bears the fewest of these distractions? To the comparisons first. Booting the game up, PS5 Pro owners are greeted to a more fleshed out graphics menu. At the top there's a new mode added to PS5 Pro called the Balanced mode, which sits in between the performance and graphics modes already present on the base PS5. In side-by-side comparison, all three offer matching quality settings in terms of textures, shadows, and draw distance for foliage. However, the key difference is in each mode's internal resolution target. So, Performance mode renders natively at 720p, Balanced mode runs at 1080p, and finally, the Quality mode runs at a much higher 1440p. All are reconstructing to a 4K target using PSSR, except creating a convincing 4K image benefits from more pixels per frame, and so, notably, the 720p Performance mode does have issues resolving a flicker-free, temporally stable result. More on that in a second. Looping back to the graphics menu, we keep individual toggles for motion blur and the frame rate target. This latter option works just as on base PS5, there's a 30 FPS cap and a so-called variable option, unlocking the frame rate to either 60Hz or 120Hz depending on your display. The 30 FPS option is still not recommended on PS5 Pro though, due to its ongoing issues with uneven frame pacing resulting in choppy motion. Frankly, it seems a waste of GPU horsepower to lock it at 30 as well, given the console's improved prospects at 60 frames per second. Rounding out, there is once again a ray tracing toggle in the menus enabling RTGI. Now, RTGI has a huge impact to Dragon's Dogma 2's darkened areas, creating thicker shade and more realistic light bounce. On PS5 Pro, RTGI is enabled by default on the Balanced and Graphics modes, but Performance mode keeps it disabled. The curious twist here is that, unlike on base PS5, it's actually possible to toggle ray tracing on and off on all modes, including the Performance mode, which means you have more scope to customize. For the purposes of testing today though, I've kept the ray tracing behavior at default setting for each mode. So, what are the Pro upgrades then? Let's compare the graphics modes first for the top tier visual experience on console. Compared to the base PS5, there's a change in resolution and upscaler of course. PS5 Pro's graphics mode runs at a native 1440p with a PSSR upscale, which all round is a pretty big change from the 4K checkerboard approach on base PS5's equivalent graphics mode. On paper, in rendering a 1920 by 2160 image, the base PS5 technically pushes more pixels per frame than PS5 Pro, but ultimately, PSSR's benefits as an upscaler overcome that deficit. The result is, PS5 Pro generates a visibly crisper image overall, with more definition resolved in distant trees and mountains during its opening flyover sequence. Also, swapping to the Performance mode on each, it's a similar story. PS5 Pro runs at just 720p with a PSSR upscale, which is an even larger cutback in pixels pushed from the checkerboard 1536 by 1728 image on base PS5. Again, there's a boost in sharpness, in clarity, with the PS5 Pro upscale via PSSR, even from a 720p base. But as mentioned, there are also more consequences in image breakup there. Speaking on that image breakup issue on PS5 Pro, this affects the game in two key ways. Firstly, there's fine detailed elements like foliage, rooftop tiles, and wood bridges, which all show more pixelation on PS5 Pro as a result of the current implementation of PSSR. Even on the graphics mode, rendering at a native 1440p, you'll still spot breakup on grass, for example. Everywhere you might look, grass tufts manifest as a kind of blurry smudge as they sway in the wind. And worse still, at a distance, the grass blades also pixelate as PSSR struggles to interpret their movement. The reconstruction to 4K is flawed here, though at least most other fine elements like hair do actually resolve correctly. The other downside is PSSR's effect on the game's ray tracing. Again, using the graphics mode as an example, with RTGI engaged, you'll notice the shade underneath grass shimmering as we approach an enclosed woodland space. Also, interiors show added noise on the RTGI effect on PS5 Pro, notably around the doorway to this inn. Note how any camera movement or occlusion from a character triggers a brief bout of noise on the affected area on PS5 Pro. Whereas if we switch over to the base PS5, the shading from RTGI is much more stable. Unfortunately, all of these issues are exaggerated on the performance mode. Comparing PS5 to PS5 Pro, the pixelation issue on animating grass is far more pronounced, creating a constant flicker as you walk through any woodland spot. At a native 720p, there's simply too much sub-pixel detail on grass blades for PSSR to stand a chance of resolving them accurately, and it often creates this distracting visual noise instead. Next, there's problem number 2 in this mode, the ambient occlusion. Ray tracing is disabled by default on performance mode of course, and I've kept that in place for PS5 Pro here. However, it appears once again, PSSR does not blend well with even the game's rasterized ambient occlusion setting. The result being that ambient shade on PS5 Pro flickers in motion around interiors, which was never an issue for the base console, and again, it's likely that PSSR is the differentiating factor that's causing it. Outside of these major differences in image quality, visual settings are broadly unchanged on PS5 Pro. The RE Engine's screen space reflection method is kept in place on Pro hardware for large water bodies. Grass LODs are also identical in this run across the orchard outside the city gates, with a matching cascade range for shadows as well. Also, NPC draw distances around the city are seemingly untouched from the base PS5 game, which is a shame given it's such a glaring issue. NPC placement is randomized, so this isn't an exact test, but it's clear that we have similar fade-in right in front of the player. With all that being said, there is a very minor difference in ambient occlusion and also shadow rendering. It's a curious change, and not necessarily always for the better. Looking close, PS5 Pro loses the dithered edges of the base PS5 shadow outlines, but in this case ends up replacing them with a more aliased, noisy effect. It's not entirely clear what the cause is or what setting it's migrated to, but this applies to all of PS5 Pro's modes: performance, balanced, and graphics. The turnout for image quality is a mixed bag then. We get a sharper image, but with a set of issues in visual noise relating to PSSR. The one indisputable upside to the PS5 Pro patch though is in its frame rate advantage. First then, let's see the graphics mode in action on each console to show the absolute heaviest GPU load possible. The good news is PS5 Pro gives us an up to 40% gain in frames per second, taking the 30 to 45 FPS range on base PS5 and putting us more typically at 40 to 55 FPS. Inevitably, CPU bottlenecked areas like the city tend to struggle most, with only a 20 to 30% gain over the base model. It's also worth noting, of course, that this is not an apples to apples comparison in rendering load either. Both PS5 consoles here render at different resolutions and with differing upscaling techniques, but it's still a fascinating stress test. Across big open city runs, taxing cutscenes, or boss battles, we get a huge uptick all round on PS5 Pro that nudges us closer to 60 FPS. And yet, despite all of that, it's still not close enough to create a watertight lock at 60, even with a VRR display. Switching over to PS5 Pro's balanced mode, for which there's no base PS5 equivalent, there is at least a big improvement in this sense. In dropping to a native 1080p and keeping RTGI in place, we're often within the 48 to 60 FPS bracket. That makes playing on a VRR display more viable. Across all the very same tests, there's a route forward here on balanced mode for a smoother playing experience, though only if you have that display technology at your disposal. Next up, we have the performance mode. PS5 and PS5 Pro offer a separate 120Hz output option which, combined with this performance mode, reveals the actual frame rate range when left fully unlocked. It's much more illuminating and lays bare the actual differential beyond the 60 FPS cap. Again, in this mode on both sides, we're hitting a plus 40% advantage on PS5 Pro and even higher at points, which translates to more than enough frames per second to make a tight 60 FPS lock possible, at least mostly. There are occasional drops to 55 FPS, for example, during the intro title sequence, and likewise, the City stress test puts the margin at a much lesser 5 to 10% advantage on PS5 Pro at lowest. Being such a CPU stress point with multiple NPCs and assets streaming in, it makes sense. And here, it's still possible to catch single frame dips with 60Hz selected. Still, in playing on PS5 Pro, this performance mode actually starts to live up to its name. Where the base model could easily dip into the 40 to 50 FPS range, this now hits the target consistently enough. Which mode is recommended on PS5 Pro then? Using the 120Hz output option to see the raw frame rate range on all three modes, only two have an actual use case. Simply put, if you do not have a VRR display, the performance mode is actually best suited for holding a mostly stable 60 FPS. It runs at between 55 to 105 FPS if left unlocked, which means on a 60Hz display, you'll spot occasional dips under the line in practice. It's rare enough though that 60 FPS is still attainable. The unfortunate trade-off is, of course, that we're faced with a native 720p image on performance mode that creates visual noise while using PSSR. Plus, to achieve this range, we sacrifice ray tracing as well. On the other end of the spectrum, the graphics mode is really too far off the mark to lock at 60 FPS, even on a VRR display. It's sadly dropping under the 48 to 60Hz range too frequently. The new balanced mode, however, offers a useful middle ground in this sense. It keeps RTGI enabled, and even in the worst case, during a city run, balanced mode is still within the ideal 48 to 60 FPS range for VRR to work. Once again, we have a PS5 Pro upgrade with a clear upside in performance, while image quality issues relating to PSSR need addressing. Unfortunately, there's no legacy mode for those wishing to return to the base PS5's resolution and upscaling method. As it stands then, unless Capcom gives us a new Pro update, we're lumbered with the additional flicker across fine details and the game's RTGI on PS5 Pro, with no means to opt out. That aside, the game does at least run much better on Pro hardware, with a much needed frame rate boost to 60 FPS that addresses a key criticism of the game on PS5. It's satisfying to see such a huge gain in frames per second. It truly solves a major issue with its console performance, but it's also a shame that the Pro patch is for now bundled with these unwanted side effects. But that's all from me today. If you did find this video useful or insightful in any way, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.